Chief Congressional Correspondent for the Washington Examiner, is with us tonight. Kirsten Powers, columnist for the Daily Beast, and we welcome to the panel Tim Farley. He's the managing editor and host of the morning briefing on Sirius XM Satellite Radio's POTUS channel. And Tim, because you're new, let's start with you. This idea of whether or not the court should even have this case before it standing was a large part of the discussion today. You were in the court. What's your sense of it?
About the first 15 minutes almost of Chris Cooper when he was arguing the case for the Proposition 8. I think that, and each one of the attorneys who got up there had to explain it. One of the big problems for the court right now is to decide whether or not even if this case should ever come there. And I thought that it was fascinating to listen to whether or not I think the court was probably looking for a way to narrow down eventually where they're going to wind up on this. That way, if they can come up with standing, they don't have to necessarily address the issue specifically about same-sex marriage, which I use as same-sex marriage as opposed to gay marriage, because gay people can get married, just not to the people they want to get married to. It's technical, but that's what this was all about, was the technicalities involved in it today. And each of the lawyers who was addressing the court had to go through that today.
Kirsten and Susan, what's your sense of this? Does the court have standing here?
I don't think they've made that decision yet. They're trying to figure out whether or not that this plaintiff should even be before the court. You know, first of all, what's the injury to them? They're asking about that. They're trying to figure out whether the case was ruled too narrowly on appeal for it to even be brought to that level. They may never get to the merits of this case, as your reporter was saying in the report earlier in the show tonight, which means we'll never get to the broader argument of the Supreme Court taking up gay marriage. I suspect from listening to the audio, I wasn't there like Tim, but I listened to the audio, sounds like they're kind of looking for a way to avoid ruling broadly, and I think that's what the general consensus is right now.
Kirsten?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think they seem to not want to have to rule on this, even saying, Justice Kennedy saying, why do we even have this case? You know, and so, which I think is going to be a major disappointment to everyone on both sides. I think people are really hoping for some sort of clarity on this issue, and if they don't provide it, then I think there's going to be huge disappointment.
To that point, let's assume for a second that they do find standing and they go ahead and they rule on this case. There's a chance that they could rule narrowly, as the Ninth Circuit did in California, just on people in California who had gotten married before Prop 8 came into effect, or whether they might, as Theodore Olson is hoping, rule more broadly on the constitutionality of gay marriage. Let's listen to Cooper and Olson as they made some of their arguments today.
There's four ways in which we can succeed in this case. The broadest argument that we made is that it's just wrong. It is not consistent with the ideals and the laws and the Constitution of this country to take our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters and put them in a class and deny them rights that we give to everyone else.
A victory here for us means that this issue returns to the people in their legislatures and their elected representatives where the debate belongs.
All right, so there you have both sides of the argument, who takes away a win or not. Yeah, I don't want you to presuppose what the court is going to do here, but is this an issue that should be ruled on broadly so that we have some guidance here nationally? In the best of all worlds, should it be thrown back to the states, or should it just deal with these thousands of couples in California who were married prior to Prop 8? Kirsten?
I guess I'm just an idealist. I think when something comes before the Supreme Court of such importance, where people are being discriminated against so blatantly, Ted Olson and David Boies have a column today in the Wall Street Journal where they talk about the Supreme Court has found 14 times that right to marry is a fundamental right. This is discrimination. It's unconstitutional. I think the Supreme Court should rule on it. You know, for them to have cowardice, essentially, to say we don't want to touch this because this is too much of a hot topic. You know, you can't, sending it back to the states. You know, we don't put rights up to a vote. It's the same thing with civil rights. This is a civil right. This is the same argument that was made with race. You know, let the states decide. Well, no, like you don't let people vote on whether people have fundamental constitutional rights. I think the Supreme Court
every
should
time
rule.
this has been put to a vote on a state level, it's gone against it. So should this be something, do you think, Susan, that's decided by the courts, or should this be decided democratically through referenda across all of the states?
Well, the counter argument would be, by allowing the states to decide, you have more buy-in into whatever the outcome will be. And there are 9 states who have voted to endorse, you know, marriage between same-sex couples. So there's buy-in for those states. If you have it foisted upon them by the Supreme Court, don't forget, there's 30 states that voted that decided marriage should be between a man and a woman. You're forcing these states to really take on something that they don't support. You know, is that the right way to approach it? Don't you want, you know, the people to decide what's going to be, you know, where the way their state's going to operate? And
No,
there's more buy-in that way.
It's not, but people don't get to vote on what's constitutional. That's what the court is for. I mean, that's the point. Like,
well, they're arguing the constitutionality right now.
But there were people who, in the South, who said that it was perfectly fine to have segregation. You know what I mean? That didn't make segregation constitutional.
Or that it was illegal for there to be interracial marriage.
Right, exactly.
What do you think, Tim? Should this be a constitutional issue or should it be a democratic issue at the state level?
Well, clearly, Ted Olson thinks it's a constitutional issue. Clearly, the other side thinks it is not. And I think that Ted Olson was much more adroit in making his argument about the institution of marriage as something that, and Justice Kagan at one point asked, well, what is the harm if this goes through? And we have the effect of same-sex marriage. I think eventually the court is going to have to decide, and frankly, even if they don't decide this time, they're going to have to make this decision. I have the feeling, and I may be wrong about this, but I keep thinking in some sneaking way that Justice Roberts is going to try to figure out a way to rule on this so that he is able to be a part of a court that moves forward on something that he's going to have to face, if not now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Family relative.
Exactly.
But what about this idea that was brought up at the court that we're too early into this to really be able to make any kind of a learned decision at the court level?
Yes, Justice Alito was talking about this issue is newer than the internet, newer than cell phones. You know, this is something that really, should they be taking this on or should they let it sort of, I think Justice Kagan said, perk at the state level for a while before they even decide whether or not to weigh in. Don't forget, if you look at the poll numbers, more and more people do support gay marriage, particularly young people. So the trend is that eventually more people will be voting to support this. So should the Supreme Court interfere or let the states work it out?
Let's leave it there. And coming up next, we'll talk about all of the crazy spending by the federal government. Don't go away.